I'll never forget the day I saw a perfectly calm, professional woman turn into a whirlwind of self-righteous fury. It was a Saturday afternoon, sunny and quiet, the kind of day you expect nothing but peace. My wife, Sophia, and I were just enjoying a quiet moment on our front porch, sipping iced tea and watching our dog, Baxter, nap in a patch of sunlight. She looked relaxed, even in her professional clothes, a sharp but casual blazer and slacks. As the president of our Homeowners Association HOA, she had a demanding job, but she always seemed to handle the stress with a quiet grace I deeply admired. Little did I know that grace was about to be put to the ultimate test by a neighbor who had decided to become a self-appointed rule enforcer. This was no ordinary neighborly dispute. It was about to become a full-blown public spectacle, one where my wife's calm demeanor was mistaken for weakness and her authority was so completely underestimated that our neighbor made the most spectacular mistake of her life. The storm rolled in onto legs, wearing a bright pink polo shirt and a scowl that could curdle milk. Her name was Brenda Jenkins, and she was the human equivalent of a fire alarm that had been pulled for a burnt toast. Brenda marched directly onto our lawn, her gaze fixed on something near our mailbox. My stomach immediately nodded. Brenda and Sophia had a history, a long, unspoken rivalry rooted in Brenda's desire to control every aspect of our community and Sophia's insistence on running things by the actual rule book, not Brenda's personal interpretation of it. Brenda's eyes were trained on a small, decorative ceramic gnome Sophia had placed under a patch of tulips. It was harmless, a whimsical little garden ornament, but in Brenda's world, it was an offense of the highest order. "That's a violation," Brenda announced, her voice sharp and accusatory, cutting through the peaceful afternoon air. Section 4, Subsection B of the HOA bylaws. No lawn ornaments of a fantastical nature without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I'm going to have to report this. Sophia, still sitting on the porch swing, took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. "Brenda," she said calmly, a hint of weariness in her voice, "there is no such bylaw. That section refers to permanent structural additions, not a 2-pound ceramic gnome." Brenda scoffed, planting her hands on her hips like a drill sergeant. "I have a copy of the bylaws right here, in my purse, and I will find it. This is an official warning." Sophia's expression remained perfectly neutral. "Brenda, I wrote the bylaws, and I'm the president of this association. I know what's in them. Now, please, remove yourself from our property." It was a simple, direct statement, but it did nothing to de-escalate the situation. In fact, it had the opposite effect. Brenda's face flushed a deep crimson. To her, this wasn't just about a gnome anymore. It was a challenge to her perceived authority in the community, a personal slight she couldn't let go of. "Oh, you're the president now, are you?" Brenda sneered, a venomous edge to her tone. "Well, that's not how it works. You can't just break the rules you're supposed to enforce." I could see Sophia's patience thinning, a faint line forming between her brows. "I'm not breaking any rules," Sophia stated firmly, now standing up and walking down the steps to stand a respectful distance from Brenda. "And for the last time, please leave." The moment Sophia spoke those words, Brenda's face twisted into an expression of pure, indignant rage. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "You know what? I'm done with your excuses," she spat. "The police will handle this. We'll see who's right when there's an official report. I'm reporting a disturbance and an HOA violation." I couldn't believe my ears. Calling the police over a garden gnome was an act of such staggering absurdity, I almost laughed. But the look on Sophia's face told me this was no laughing matter. She just stood there, her hands clasped, watching as Brenda spoke into her phone, her voice a theatrical whisper filled with exaggerated distress. I wanted to step in, to tell Brenda she had gone too far, but I knew that would only give her more ammunition. This was Sophia's battle, and she had to fight it on her own terms. As Brenda finished her call and glared triumphantly at my wife, a new sound began to fill the air. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder, was the distinct wail of a siren. I looked down the street, and sure enough, A black and white patrol car was turning the corner, its lights flashing in the afternoon sun. Brenda's smile widened. She thought she was winning, that this was the moment her perceived authority would finally be validated. She believed a police officer would side with her, issue a fine, and prove her right. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the officer approaching our home had a very different relationship with my wife than she could ever imagine. The patrol car pulled up to the curb, and the officer, a tall man with an air of quiet professionalism, stepped out. He was here for a disturbance, and as he approached our front lawn, Brenda's triumphant sneer was about to turn into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The police cruiser stopped, its red and blue lights painting a soft, pulsing glow on the manicured lawns. Officer Ben Carter emerged from the car with a practiced, efficient stride. He was a young man, but his expression was that of someone who had seen it all, detached, professional, and slightly weary. He approached our lawn, his eyes scanning the scene, a furious woman in a pink polo, a calmly composed woman with her hands clasped, and me, just standing there trying to make sense of the madness. "Ma'am, you called this in?" he asked Brenda, his voice a low, even rumble. Brenda's triumphant sneer returned. "Officer? Yes. She's violating the Homeowners Association rules. It's about that ridiculous gnome there, and she's being completely uncooperative." She pointed a shaking finger at the ceramic statue as if it were a weapon. Officer Carter's gaze followed her finger to the gnome. I saw a fleeting look of confusion on his face, but he quickly masked it with his professional blankness. He took out a small notepad and a pen. "And what exactly is the nature of the violation?" he asked. Brenda launched into a dramatic, exaggerated recount of the incident, her voice rising in pitch with every sentence. "It's a nuisance, and it's against the bylaws. She says she wrote the bylaws, but she's just making it up as she goes along. She needs to be fined immediately. We can't have people just putting up any old junk they want to." As she spoke, she gestured wildly, her indignation a performance for an audience of one. Officer Carter just nodded slowly, jotting down notes without looking up. It was a classic police tactic: let the person vent, gather the information, and decide on a course of action later. My anxiety was a tight knot in my chest. I watched Sophia, who remained perfectly still and quiet until Brenda had finally run out of steam. The officer turned to her. "Ma'am," he asked. Sophia met his gaze calmly. "Officer," she began, her voice steady and clear, "the item in question is a decorative garden gnome. There is nothing in our HOA bylaws that prohibits such a thing. My neighbor, Brenda, is misinterpreting a section regarding permanent structures. She called you because she wants me to receive a fine for a rule that doesn't exist." It was a concise, rational defense, stripped of all the emotional drama Brenda had just presented. But Officer Carter just nodded again, his face betraying no emotion. He had heard to conflicting stories, and now he had to make a judgment. "I'll need to see some identification, ma'am, for the incident report," he said, turning his notepad towards Sophia. I felt a fresh wave of panic. Why did he need to file a report? This was so absurd. It felt like Brenda's lunacy was actually going to be rewarded with some form of official documentation, a black mark on our record over a ceramic gnome. I wanted to scream, to tell the officer to look past Brenda's theatrics and see the simple truth. But Sophia just gave me a reassuring look. It was a silent conversation, a message that said, "It's okay. I've got this." She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her wallet, and produced her driver's license. She handed it to Officer Carter without a word. As he took it, I saw Brenda preen with a smug smile, convinced she was just moments away from victory. She imagined the fine being issued, the official report being filed, her own version of justice. Officer Carter held the ID, his thumb lightly tracing the edges. He glanced at it, then back at Sophia. For a second, his detached professionalism held firm. But then, as his eyes focused on the name on the card, something shifted. A subtle, but very definite change came over him. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, and he brought the card closer to his face, as if to make sure he was reading it correctly. He looked up at Sophia, no longer with a professional detachment, but with a flicker of recognition and something else. It looked like respect. Maybe a hint of confusion mixed with surprise. His lips parted slightly as if he was about to say something, but no sound came out. He then looked from Sophia to the gnome, then back at her, a new understanding dawning on his face. He finally seemed to be connecting the dots. Brenda, still basking in her perceived victory, was oblivious to this seismic shift in the power dynamic. She was too busy imagining the fine. I saw Officer Carter's posture straighten just a little. He was no longer just an officer on a call. He was a subordinate looking at a superior. I watched the realization wash over him like a wave, and I knew, in that very moment, that Brenda's flawless plan was about to crash and burn. The air suddenly grew thick with a silence that felt heavier than the midday heat. Officer Ben Carter stood still, his eyes fixed on Sophia's ID. The casual, detached professionalism that had been his shield just moments ago completely fell away, replaced by an expression of shock and dawning realization. He lifted his head slowly, his gaze moving from the small card to Sophia's face. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as a woman involved in a minor complaint, but as someone of true authority. He didn't just recognize her, he recognized her title, Ms. Miller, as in, President Miller. He finally stammered, his voice no longer the flat, official tone from before, but one laced with a genuine and palpable surprise. Brenda, who had been watching with a triumphant sneer, was utterly confused by the officer's sudden shift. Her smugness began to melt into a look of baffled impatience. "What are you talking about, officer?" she snapped, gesturing at Sophia. "Just write the report. I'm not waiting around all day for this." She was so consumed by her own self-importance that she couldn't comprehend the dramatic turn the situation was taking. She thought the officer was simply distracted, a minor delay before her victory. But I saw the way Officer Carter's posture had changed. The slight slouch was gone, replaced by a rigid, almost military-like straightness. His respect was no longer just a courtesy, it was a reflex. Sophia met his gaze, a calm, knowing smile spreading across her lips. "Yes, officer," she said, her voice smooth and unhurried. "That would be me, President of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association." The words hung in the air. A silent bomb dropped on the tense scene. Brenda's triumphant sneer vanished instantly. Her mouth fell open in a silent gasp of disbelief, her eyes widening as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She looked from Sophia to the officer, then back again, her brain clearly struggling to process the impossible truth. The woman she had called the police on was, in fact, the very person who held the highest authority in the community's rule-making body. Officer Carter's face flushed slightly with embarrassment. He quickly handed Sophia her ID back, his movements now almost deferential. "My sincere apologies, President Miller," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I didn't recognize you at first. I work closely with the HOA board on a lot of our community safety initiatives. We were just in a meeting last week about the new speed bumps on Elm Street. I presented the proposal you approved. I should have made the connection." The apology was sincere and heartfelt. He was no longer on a routine call. He was standing before his professional superior, and he was clearly mortified by the misunderstanding. Brenda's face, a moment ago a mask of shock, now contorted into pure, unadulterated humiliation. She had called the police to enforce a rule, the very person who wrote the rules, and was now receiving an apology from the officer she had summoned. The irony was so profound it was almost comical. She started to splutter. But she was in violation. I saw it. The rules say." Officer Carter cut her off, his voice now firm and authoritative, completely devoid of the detached politeness he had used with her just moments before. He was no longer there to just listen to her complaint. He was there to protect a professional relationship, to maintain order, and to, most importantly, correct a glaring misjudgment. He turned his body slightly, his full attention now on Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "I work directly with the president of the HOA. I am fully aware of the community bylaws. There is no violation here. This is a private matter, and it is not a police issue. You called in a false report and caused a public disturbance. I suggest you go back to your home and refrain from making any more calls to our department unless it is a genuine emergency." He then looked at Sophia and gave a slight, respectful nod. David and I just stood there, watching Brenda's world completely fall apart. Her face was pale, and she looked from the unyielding officer to Sophia, who just stood there calmly. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted. The one who had summoned authority to find someone was now being rebuked by that very authority. Brenda was defeated. Her shoulders slumped, her triumphant scowl replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had just realized they'd made a very public, very stupid mistake. Officer Ben Carter's voice, now a sharp and direct command, cut through the stunned silence. He turned his back on Sophia and fully faced Brenda, who stood there like a statue carved from pure mortification. "Ms. Jenkins, the complaint you filed is unfounded," he stated, his voice ringing with finality. "As I've just clarified with your HOA President, the item in question is not in violation of any community bylaws. This is not a matter for police intervention." Brenda's face, already pale with shock, began to twist in a desperate attempt to salvage her authority. But it's a nuisance," she protested weakly, her voice cracking. "It's an eyesore. My property values are going to drop." Officer Carter sighed, a small but clear sign of his dwindling patience. He then reached for his notepad once more. "I am officially documenting this as a false report, Ms. Jenkins," he said, his pen scratching against the paper. "And I'm also going to have to write you a warning for obstructing a driveway." He pointed to her car, which was parked diagonally, blocking a portion of our neighbor's driveway across the street. It was a subtle, almost poetic act of justice. Brenda had summoned an officer to find my wife over an imaginary violation, and now she was receiving an official warning for a very real one she had committed herself in her zealous rage. I felt a swell of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a win for Sophia. It was a righteous smackdown for Brenda, who had spent years trying to control everyone around her. Brenda's face was a masterpiece of crushed ego. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and she looked at the officer, then at Sophia, then at her car as if she were seeing it all for the first time. The defiance was gone, replaced by a deep and hollow humiliation. She was so completely defeated. She couldn't even manage an argument. Officer Carter, however, wasn't quite finished. He had a duty to perform, and he was going to see it through with an unflinching professionalism that only made Brenda's defeat more complete. He handed her the warning slip. "This is a courtesy warning, Ms. Jenkins. Next time, it'll be a citation and a fine." Sophia, seeing Brenda's total capitulation, stepped forward. She didn't gloat, didn't make a single triumphant gesture. Instead, her voice was calm and empathetic, the very picture of true leadership. "Thank you, Officer Carter," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I appreciate you clarifying the situation. Perhaps, to prevent misunderstandings in the future, we can work with the board to create a simple, easily accessible guide for all residents. I'll make sure it's a priority at our next meeting." Her words were a subtle jab at Brenda's incompetence, a public demonstration of her own proactive leadership that stood in stark contrast to Brenda's petty complaints. Officer Carter nodded respectfully. "That would be a great idea, President Miller. It's always good to have things in writing. Thank you." As Officer Carter turned to leave, he tipped his hat to Sophia, a gesture of pure respect. Brenda, clutching the warning slip, spun on her heel and practically ran to her car, her face a mask of shame. She scrambled into the driver's seat, started the engine with a roar, and sped off down the street, kicking up a small cloud of dust. She didn't even look back. I watched her go, a sense of deep, quiet satisfaction washing over me. This wasn't just about a garden gnome or an HOA rule. It was about two different kinds of power. Brenda's power was a loud, empty, and performative noise. Sophia's was a quiet, unshakable authority that came from integrity and respect. Sophia watched Brenda's car disappear around the corner before turning to me with a small, exhausted smile. "Well," she said, "that was an eventful afternoon." I wrapped my arm around her, proud of the way she had handled the entire situation with such grace and dignity. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. In a neighborhood like ours, where news travels faster than a speeding car, a moment this public, this humiliating, would not be forgotten. The story would spread, and Brenda's carefully cultivated image as the neighborhood watchdog would be replaced by a new, more accurate one. This event, so small on the surface, had the potential to linger far longer than any fine. The sting of public defeat, I knew, was a lesson Brenda Jenkins would carry for a very long time. Later that evening, the chaotic energy of the afternoon had completely dissipated. Sophia and I sat on our back porch, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The absurdity of it all had finally hit us, and we couldn't stop laughing. "Can you believe it?" Sophia said, a genuine, joyful laugh escaping her lips. "All that over a 2-pound ceramic gnome." I smiled, pulling her closer. "I told you that gnome was a warrior. It fought for its right to exist." We shared a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after a shared victory, no matter how small or ridiculous the fight. It was a victory not just for us, but for common sense. The true impact of the incident wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Within a week, the story had spread through Maplewood Heights like wildfire. Neighbors who had long suffered under Brenda's self-appointed rule enforcement approached us, not with gossip, but with a new respect for Sophia. They'd always known she was a fair and capable HOA president, but now they saw her in a new light as a leader who could handle a crisis with grace, dignity, and a little bit of quiet strength. We got thank you notes, friendly waves, and even a few anonymous bouquets of flowers left on our porch. The community's trust in Sophia had not just been affirmed, it had been solidified, and Brenda, the incident had a profound, if temporary, effect on her. For a few weeks, we barely saw her. Her once constant presence, the sharp-eyed watchfulness, the overly critical glances was gone. When she finally did reappear, she was a ghost of her former self. Her usual confident stride was replaced by a hesitant shuffle. She no longer marched up to people's lawns. Instead, she'd cross the street to avoid them. Her once venomous voice was now a barely audible whisper whenever she had to speak to anyone. She had been publicly and thoroughly humiliated, and for a short time, it seemed to have taught her a lesson about overstepping boundaries. She was still Brenda? Of course, we'd catch her giving disapproving glares from her window, a silent, impotent rage burning in her eyes. The urge to control was still there, but her power to act on it had been broken. This incident, born of a petty dispute, had inadvertently reinforced Sophia's position as a truly respected leader. It wasn't a speech or a new policy that had earned her the community's favor. It was her unwavering calm in the face of irrational fury, her reliance on facts over emotions, and her quiet authority that spoke volumes. The entire absurd event had served as a public test of her character, and she had passed with flying colors. It was a lesson for everyone in the neighborhood that true leadership is not about shouting the loudest or filing the most complaints, but about a quiet, unshakable sense of purpose. As for me, David Miller, I learned my own lesson that day. I learned that my wife, the calm and collected Sophia, was not just my partner but a force to be reckoned with. I saw Karen at her peak, only to witness her spectacular fall from grace. I watched a professional police officer and agent of the law bow to the real authority in the room, the woman who was a leader, not just by title, but by her sheer poise and integrity. It was the most satisfying thing I'd ever seen. So, if you ever find yourself facing a Karen who insists on calling the cops on you for something ridiculous, just remember, your true authority might be the one thing she never sees coming. And sometimes, the sweetest victory isn't about winning an argument. It's about watching them call in the cavalry, only to find out you're the general.